The morning sun cast long shadows across the wheat fields of Nebraska when Jake Morrison first saw the ships. Three massive vessels, each the size of a small city, descended through Earth's atmosphere with the grace of falling leaves. The world held its breath as humanity made first contact with an alien civilization that called themselves the Draconian Empire. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned against his old pickup truck, watching the news crews flood into his small farming town. At 32, he had spent his entire life working the same land his grandfather had farmed, growing corn and wheat that fed thousands of families across the Midwest. He never imagined that his quiet life would intersect with galactic politics. The Draconians were unlike anything humanity had expected. Standing nearly 8 feet tall with scaled skin that shimmered like precious metals, they possessed an otherworldly beauty that commanded respect. Their leader, Ambassador Zarathul, spoke with a voice that resonated like distant thunder. She announced that Earth had been selected for a cultural exchange program, one that would determine humanity's place in the greater galactic community. "Your species shows promise," Zarathul declared during the first global broadcast. "But you must prove your worth through the ancient trials of partnership. Those who succeed will join our empire as valued allies. Those who fail will remain isolated on this distant world." Jake scratched his head as he watched the broadcast on his phone. The whole thing seemed like something out of a science fiction movie. Governments around the world scrambled to understand what these trials meant, while military leaders prepared for the possibility that this was some kind of invasion disguised as diplomacy. The answer came 3 days later when Zarathul made a shocking announcement. The trials would not be tests of military might or technological advancement. Instead, they would be trials of matrimony. The Draconian Empire believed that true alliance could only be formed through the sacred bonds of marriage between their people and humanity. "In our culture," Zarathul explained to a stunned United Nations assembly, "marriage represents the ultimate merger of souls, minds, and purposes. A Draconian who takes a mate from another species brings that entire species under the protection and guidance of our empire. It is the highest honor we can bestow." The revelation sent shockwaves through human society. Religious leaders debated the theological implications. Politicians argued about the legal frameworks. Scientists wondered about the biological compatibility, but perhaps most shocking of all was Zarathul's next announcement. "I have observed your species for many cycles," she said, her golden eyes scanning the assembly. "I have chosen my intended mate. He is not among your leaders or warriors. He is a cultivator of crops, a tender of the earth. His name is Jake Morrison of Nebraska, and I claim him as my destined partner." Jake nearly choked on his coffee when his phone started buzzing with calls from reporters, government officials, and distant relatives he hadn't heard from in years. Within hours, his modest farmhouse was surrounded by news vans, military vehicles, and curious onlookers. The quiet life he had always known was gone forever. A black SUV arrived that evening, carrying officials from the State Department who explained that Jake had become a person of national interest. They offered protection, media training, and the resources of the entire United States government. They also made it clear that his decision would affect not just his own life, but potentially the future of human civilization. "No pressure," muttered Agent Sarah Chen as she showed Jake classified files about draconian technology and military capabilities. "But if this works out, we could have access to faster-than-light travel, advanced medicine, and energy systems that could solve climate change. If it doesn't work out, we might find ourselves on the wrong side of an interstellar empire that spans half the galaxy." Jake spent the night walking through his cornfields, thinking about the impossible situation he found himself in. He had never been married, never even had a serious long-term relationship. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 25, leaving him to run the farm alone. He had always been more comfortable with plants than people, more at ease with the predictable cycles of planting and harvest than the complexities of human relationships. Now he was being asked to marry an alien dragon woman who could apparently breathe fire and lift a car with her bare hands. The rational part of his mind told him it was insane. The practical part wondered how he could possibly relate to someone from a completely different world and culture. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite name. When he had seen Zarathul on television, he had noticed the way she moved with quiet confidence, the intelligence in her eyes, and the careful precision of her words. She wasn't a monster or a conqueror. She was someone trying to build bridges between worlds, and she had somehow chosen him as her partner in that effort. The next morning brought Zarathul herself to his farm. She arrived without fanfare, walking alone through his wheat fields as if she had been doing it all her life. Up close, she was even more impressive than on television. Her scales caught the morning light like polished copper, and her presence radiated a kind of ancient wisdom that made Jake feel like a schoolboy. "You have questions," she said, her voice softer than he expected. "This is natural. I too have questions about your kind, about you specifically. Perhaps we might speak honestly with each other." They sat on the porch of his farmhouse, two beings from different worlds sharing coffee and trying to understand each other. Zarathul explained that draconian society was built around the concept of complementary strengths. Their species was long-lived, powerful, and technologically advanced, but they had lost something vital along the way. "We have become too focused on conquest and expansion," she admitted. "We have forgotten the simple pleasures of creation and nurture. Your species, despite its youth and limitations, possesses something we have lost. You create life from soil and water. You find joy in simple accomplishments. You form bonds of loyalty that transcend logic or personal benefit." Jake found himself talking about his love for farming, the satisfaction of watching crops grow from tiny seeds into abundant harvests. He explained how his grandfather had taught him to read the weather, to understand the needs of different plants, to work with the natural cycles rather than against them. "My people would say that farming is beneath the dignity of a true warrior," Zarathul mused. "But I see the wisdom in what you do. You nurture life where others might only see empty dirt. You plan for seasons that extend beyond your immediate needs. You understand that true strength comes from patience and persistence, not just force." As they talked, Jake began to see glimpses of the person behind the imposing exterior. Zarathul spoke about her childhood on Draco's Prime, where she had been trained from birth to be a diplomat and ambassador. She had studied dozens of alien cultures, but Earth was the first world that had truly captivated her imagination. "Your movies and literature speak of love as a transformative force," she said with obvious curiosity. "This concept is foreign to my people. We mate for genetic compatibility and political advantage. But your species treats love as something that can overcome any obstacle, bridge any divide. I wish to understand this power." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several other draconian ships. Zarathul's expression grew tense as she watched them land in the fields beyond Jake's property. She explained that not all of her people supported her choice of a human mate. Many considered it a dangerous precedent that could weaken the Empire's position in the galaxy. "There are those who believe that humans should remain subordinate partners, useful but not equal," she said grimly. "They will attempt to prove that your species is unworthy of true alliance. They will test you in ways that may seem unfair or impossible." Jake watched as armored draconian warriors emerged from the ships, their weapons and technology making Earth's military look like children playing with toys. He realized that his personal decision about marriage had become the focal point for a much larger conflict about humanity's future in the galaxy. That evening, he called his childhood friend Marcus, who had become an agricultural scientist and worked for the Department of Agriculture in Washington. Marcus had always been the smart one, the one who understood complex systems and long-term strategies. "This is bigger than just you, Jake," Marcus said after hearing the full story. "If the Draconians are telling the truth about their empire spanning half the galaxy, then this marriage could determine whether humanity becomes a partner or remains isolated. But if it goes wrong, we could end up as a conquered species." Jake stared at the stars that night, knowing that behind that peaceful darkness lay civilizations and conflicts he could barely imagine. He was just a farmer from Nebraska, but somehow his choice would echo across the galaxy. The weight of that responsibility was almost crushing. The next morning brought news that would change everything. 3 more draconian ambassadors had arrived on Earth, each claiming the right to select their own human mates. But these were not diplomatic missions like Zarathul's. They were challenges, tests designed to prove that humans were unworthy of equal partnership with the Empire. Ambassador Kethrak landed in the Nevada desert and declared that he would only marry a human who could best him in single combat. Ambassador Visendra descended upon Tokyo and announced that her chosen mate must demonstrate technological innovation that surpassed draconian engineering. Ambassador Morthek arrived in the Amazon rainforest, and stated that he would marry only someone who could survive in the most hostile environment on Earth for 30 days without any modern equipment. Each challenge was designed to be impossible for humans to achieve. The Draconians who issued them were hardliners who wanted to prove that humanity was too weak, too primitive, and too divided to deserve true alliance with the Empire. Zarathol was furious when she learned of these interference campaigns. She explained to Jake that this was exactly what she had feared. Her decision to choose a human mate had been seen as a sign of weakness by the militant faction within Draconian society. "They seek to humiliate your species," she said, her scales shifting to a darker, more aggressive coloration. "If these challenges are not met, they will use the failures as proof that humans should remain as subjects rather than partners. But the challenges themselves are unfair. They test individual human limitations rather than human potential." Jake spent hours thinking about the situation. He could see the trap that had been set. If humans failed the challenges, they would be labeled as inferior. If they somehow succeeded, the hardliners would simply devise new and more impossible tests. The whole system was designed to keep humanity in a subordinate position. But Jake had grown up on a farm, where problems were solved through patient observation and creative thinking rather than brute force. He began to see possibilities that others might miss. "What if we change the game?" he asked Zarathol that evening. "What if instead of trying to beat them at their own challenges, we show them something they don't expect, something uniquely human?" Zarathol raised one elegant eyebrow, a gesture that looked surprisingly human despite her alien features. "Explain your thinking, Jake Morrison." Jake pointed to his wheat fields, where the grain was beginning to turn golden in the late summer heat. "Your people are warriors and conquerors. They understand strength and technology and dominance. But do they understand cooperation? Do they understand how humans can work together to achieve things that none of us could accomplish alone?" He explained his idea, and for the first time since her arrival on Earth, Zarathol smiled. It was an expression that transformed her entire face, making her seem less like an alien ambassador and more like a woman who had found something worth believing in. "You propose to teach dragons about farming?" she asked with obvious amusement. "I propose to show them what humans are really capable of when we work together," Jake replied. "Every harvest is a collaboration between thousands of people. The seed companies, the equipment manufacturers, the transportation networks, the processing facilities. No one person grows the food that feeds a nation. We do it together, each person contributing what they do best." Zarathol was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. "This is not how my people think," she said finally. "We are taught that true achievement comes from individual excellence, from proving one's superiority over others. But what you describe sounds like it might be more powerful than any individual strength." The plan they developed together was ambitious and risky. Instead of responding to the challenges set by the other Draconian ambassadors, they would issue a challenge of their own. They would invite the entire Draconian delegation to witness something that no single human could accomplish alone: the complete harvest, processing, and distribution of food for an entire region, all coordinated through voluntary cooperation rather than central command. It was a gamble that would either prove humanity's worth as partners or expose them as delusional primitives who didn't understand their place in the galaxy. But Jake had spent his life betting everything on the hope that seeds planted in good soil would eventually bear fruit. The announcement of their counter-challenge sent ripples through both human and Draconian society. Government officials were terrified that Jake was overstepping his authority. Military leaders worried that he was antagonizing potential allies. But agricultural communities across the Midwest began volunteering to participate, sensing that this was their chance to show the galaxy what they were capable of achieving. As Jake stood in his fields that evening, watching the alien ships gleaming in the distance like fallen stars, he realized that his quiet life as a farmer was over forever. But maybe, just maybe, he was about to help plant the seeds of something even more important than corn and wheat. He was about to plant the seeds of humanity's future among the stars. Zarathol joined him in the gathering darkness, her presence both comforting and electric. "Are you certain about this path?" she asked softly. "Once we begin, there will be no retreat. Your species will be judged by what happens in the coming days." Jake looked at the woman who had chosen him from among all the humans on Earth, this powerful being who had somehow seen something in a simple farmer worth building an alliance around. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he said. "Let's show them what humans can really do." The galaxy was about to discover that sometimes the most extraordinary strength comes from the most ordinary places, and that a man who knows how to make things grow might just know how to make civilizations flourish as well. The morning of the great demonstration dawned crisp and clear across the American heartland. Jake stood in his kitchen at 4 in the morning, brewing coffee and watching the news reports flood in from around the world. The draconian challenge had captured global attention, with agricultural communities from every continent offering support for what had become known as the Harvest Alliance. Zarathul emerged from the guest room where she had been staying, her scales gleaming with an iridescent quality that Jake had learned indicated excitement or anticipation. She had adapted remarkably well to human customs, though she still insisted on sleeping on the floor rather than in a bed, claiming that draconians were more comfortable on firm surfaces. "The coordination networks are functioning beyond our projections," she reported, consulting a crystalline device that seemed to interface directly with her nervous system. 17,000 agricultural facilities across your continent have volunteered to participate. Your species' communication systems have enabled real-time coordination on a scale that our military strategists would find impressive. Jake nodded, though privately he was amazed by the response. He had expected maybe a few dozen farms in neighboring counties to join their demonstration. Instead, agricultural cooperatives from Canada to Mexico had offered to participate, creating a continental network of food production and distribution that would operate as a single coordinated system. The challenge they had issued was simple in concept, but incredibly complex in execution. They would demonstrate how human civilization could feed itself through voluntary cooperation, with no central command structure and no coercive authority. Every participant would contribute according to their abilities and resources, coordinating through communication and mutual benefit rather than orders from above. The draconian observers had initially dismissed this as primitive chaos that would inevitably collapse into inefficiency and conflict. Ambassador Kethrak had publicly predicted that human cooperation would break down within hours when individual self-interest overcame collective goals. "Your species lacks the discipline for true coordination," he had declared during a press conference at the United Nations. "Only a strong hierarchy with clear chains of command can accomplish complex objectives. This demonstration will prove that humans require draconian guidance to achieve anything of significance." But Jake had grown up watching farmers work together during harvest seasons, when time was critical and everyone understood that individual success depended on collective achievement. He knew that humans could coordinate complex activities without coercion when they shared common goals and understood their mutual interdependence. The first test came at sunrise, when harvesting operations began simultaneously across multiple time zones. Combines moved through wheat fields in Kansas while corn harvesters worked in Illinois. Cotton pickers operated in Texas as apple orchards were harvested in Washington. Trucks began moving along planned routes to transport crops to processing facilities, which had prepared their operations to handle the coordinated influx of raw materials. Zarathul monitored the communications networks, translating the coordination patterns for the draconian observers who watched with increasing bewilderment. Their military minds were accustomed to rigid command structures where orders flowed down from central authority. What they were witnessing defied their understanding of how complex operations could be managed. "There is no supreme commander," Ambassador Visandra observed with obvious confusion. "No single authority coordinating these activities. How do they maintain synchronization without a control hierarchy?" Jake smiled as he explained the concept that seemed so natural to him, but was apparently revolutionary to the draconians. Every farmer knows that their success depends on the success of their neighbors. If the transportation networks fail, everyone's crops rot in the fields. If the processing facilities shut down, everyone loses their harvest. So everyone has incentive to make sure everyone else succeeds. He showed them the communication networks where farmers shared real-time information about weather conditions, equipment breakdowns, and traffic patterns. When a harvester broke down in Iowa, 3 neighboring farms immediately offered equipment loans. When a processing facility in Nebraska experienced a power outage, 2 competing facilities in Kansas offered to handle the overflow until repairs were completed. The Draconians watched with fascination as problems were solved through spontaneous cooperation rather than central planning. No one had ordered the farmers to help each other. No authority had mandated the sharing of resources. Yet the system continued to function efficiently because everyone understood that their individual success was linked to collective achievement. Ambassador Morthek was particularly intrigued by the economic aspects of the cooperation. In our empire, resource allocation is managed by the Logistics Council, which determines optimal distribution based on strategic priorities. But your farmers are negotiating resource sharing in real time, adjusting to changing conditions without reference to higher authority. How do they determine fair exchange rates? Jake had anticipated this question. They've been trading with each other for generations. They know the value of different services and resources because they've built relationships over time. Trust reduces transaction costs and enables rapid negotiation because everyone's reputation is on the line. As the day progressed, the scope of the coordination became increasingly apparent. Grain elevators synchronized their operations to handle the influx of crops. Transportation companies rerouted trucks to maintain optimal flow patterns. Food processing facilities adjusted their schedules to accommodate the coordinated harvest. Even retail distribution networks modified their operations to handle the planned surge of products. The Draconian observers were stunned by the scale and complexity of the voluntary coordination. Their own logistics systems were marvels of efficiency, but they required massive bureaucracies and rigid command structures to function. What they were witnessing seemed to accomplish similar coordination through networks of voluntary relationships and shared understanding. This level of cooperation would require months of planning by our Strategic Coordination Division, admitted Ambassador Kethrak, his earlier skepticism beginning to waver. Yet your farmers accomplished this coordination in mere days, with no central authority and no enforcement mechanisms. Zarathul translated Jake's explanation about the social infrastructure that made such coordination possible. Human agricultural communities have developed what they call social capital over generations. They have relationships of trust and reciprocity that enable rapid cooperation when circumstances require it. Each farmer knows dozens of others personally, understands their capabilities and reliability, and expects to interact with them for years to come. The afternoon brought the first serious test of the system's resilience. A major thunderstorm system moved through the Midwest, threatening to disrupt harvesting operations and transportation schedules. Under normal circumstances, such weather would cause significant delays and losses as individual operators struggled to adapt their plans. But the coordinated network responded with impressive flexibility. Farmers in the path of the storm accelerated their harvesting operations, working through the night to complete critical work before the weather arrived. Transportation routes were dynamically adjusted to avoid storm-affected areas. Processing facilities modified their schedules to handle early deliveries from storm-threatened regions. Most impressively, farmers outside the storm zone volunteered to extend their operations to compensate for areas that might be temporarily shut down. The system adapted organically to changing conditions, maintaining overall productivity even when individual components faced disruption. The Draconian observers exchanged glances that Jake had learned to recognize as their equivalent of astonishment. Ambassador Visendra spoke first. Our logistics networks would require hours of recalculation and formal authorization to implement such adaptive responses. Yet your coordination network achieved this adjustment in minutes through informal communication. Jake explained the concept that farmers called paying it forward. When someone helped you during an emergency, you didn't necessarily repay them directly. Instead, you helped someone else when they faced problems, knowing that this maintained the overall system of mutual support that everyone depended on. It's like insurance, he said, watching their expression closely. Everyone contributes to maintaining the system because everyone benefits from its existence. No one keeps exact accounts because the relationships are more valuable than the immediate transactions. As evening approached, the first results of the coordinated harvest began to appear in grocery stores and food distribution centers across the continent. Fresh produce that had been growing in fields that morning was being sold to consumers by evening, demonstrating the efficiency of the integrated system. But more importantly, detailed records were being maintained of every aspect of the operation. The volume of crops harvested, the efficiency of transportation networks, the speed of processing operations, and the cost-effectiveness of the entire system. These metrics would prove that voluntary human cooperation could achieve results that rivaled or exceeded centrally planned alternatives. The evening news carried reports from around the world as agricultural communities on every continent began implementing similar demonstrations. Wheat farmers in Ukraine coordinated with processors in Germany. Rice farmers in Vietnam synchronized operations with transportation networks in Thailand. Coffee growers in Colombia worked with roasters in Brazil to optimize the entire production chain. The global scope of the demonstration had an unexpected effect on the draconian observers. They had expected to study a primitive local phenomenon, but they were witnessing evidence that human cooperation could operate on planetary scales without requiring imperial authority structures. Ambassador Zarathol had remained quiet through most of the day, observing her colleagues' reactions as much as the human demonstration itself. That evening, she spoke privately with Jake about the implications of what they had accomplished. "My people are beginning to understand that they may have misjudged human capabilities," she said as they walked through his wheat fields under the stars. "But this also threatens fundamental assumptions about how civilizations must be organized. If humans can coordinate complex activities through voluntary relationships, what does that suggest about the necessity of imperial authority?" Jake had been thinking about the same question. The Draconian Empire was built on the premise that civilization required strong central authority to prevent chaos and inefficiency. But human agricultural communities had been proving for generations that complex coordination could emerge from voluntary relationships and mutual benefit. "Maybe the question isn't whether empires are necessary," he suggested. "Maybe it's whether there are different ways to organize civilization that work for different species. Your people might need strong central authority because of how you think and relate to each other. But humans might work better with networks of voluntary relationships." Zarathol considered this possibility with obvious fascination. "If that is true, then alliance between our species could provide benefits that neither could achieve alone. Draconian strength and organization combined with human adaptability and voluntary cooperation could create something unprecedented in the galaxy." The second day of the demonstration brought new challenges and even more impressive results. The coordinated agricultural network had not only maintained efficiency throughout the first day, but had actually improved its performance as participants learned from experience and refined their cooperation methods. Processing facilities reported record efficiency as they received predictably timed deliveries of uniform quality crops. Transportation networks achieved optimal load factors as careful coordination eliminated empty return trips and maximized vehicle utilization. Even retail distribution systems were operating more smoothly as they received steady flows of fresh products rather than irregular surges and shortages. The Draconian observers spent the day studying the economic data, trying to understand how voluntary coordination could achieve such impressive results. Their own empire relied on central planning and resource allocation managed by vast bureaucracies. The efficiency of the human system challenged their fundamental assumptions about optimal organization. Ambassador Kethrak was particularly focused on conflict resolution mechanisms. In his experience, complex operations inevitably generated disputes about resource allocation and priority decisions. Yet the human network seemed to resolve such conflicts through negotiation and compromise rather than authority and coercion. "When disagreements arise, how do you determine the correct solution?" he asked Jake during a tour of a grain elevator facility. Jake introduced him to the elevator manager, Sarah Thompson, who had been coordinating with dozens of farms and transportation companies. She explained how conflicts were typically resolved through what she called enlightened self-interest. "If two farms both need the same transportation slot, we look for solutions that work for everyone," she said. "Maybe one farm can delay their delivery by a few hours in exchange for priority on another day. Maybe we can find additional transportation capacity that serves both needs. People are usually willing to compromise when they know the other party will reciprocate in the future." The Draconian ambassador studied this explanation with obvious confusion. But what if compromise is impossible? What if resources are truly scarce and allocation must be zero-sum? Sarah smiled. Then we get creative. Maybe we can increase capacity or find substitute resources or restructure the problem so it's not zero-sum anymore. Farmers are good at solving problems because we deal with scarcity and uncertainty every day. We've learned that cooperation usually creates more value than competition. As the demonstration entered its third day, the global scope of human agricultural cooperation had captured the attention of every major news network and government on Earth. But more importantly, it had achieved something that no one had anticipated. It had begun to change draconian perceptions of what was possible in galactic civilization. The hardliner ambassadors who had come to Earth expecting to prove human inferiority were instead discovering evidence that their own imperial system might not be the only viable model for organizing advanced civilization. This revelation had profound implications for the Draconian Empire and its relationships with hundreds of other species across the galaxy. Jake realized that their agricultural demonstration had become something much larger than a test of human worthiness. It had become a challenge to fundamental assumptions about power, authority, and the nature of civilization itself. The seeds they had planted in Nebraska soil were beginning to grow into ideas that might reshape the galaxy. But as the third evening approached, Jake also sensed that the real test was still to come. The draconian hardliners were not going to abandon their worldview easily, and they had resources and authority that could make life very difficult for anyone who challenged their position. The success of the harvest demonstration might actually increase the danger rather than reduce it. Zarathul confirmed his concerns when she received communications from Draco's Prime that evening. The demonstration had attracted attention from the highest levels of the Empire, including factions that viewed any challenge to imperial authority as a threat to be eliminated. There are those who would rather destroy Earth than allow human ideas about voluntary cooperation to spread to other worlds, she warned. The success of your demonstration has made you a target, not just in curiosity. Jake looked out at his fields, where alien ships gleamed under the stars like promises of a future he could barely imagine. He had started this journey as a simple farmer trying to save his world. Now he realized he might be fighting for the future of civilization itself. The galaxy was watching, and the next few days would determine whether the seeds of cooperation they had planted would be allowed to grow, or whether they would be cut down by those who feared change more than they valued progress. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened on the fourth day of the harvest demonstration, broadcast live to billions of beings across known space. Jake watched the proceedings on a massive holographic display that Zarathul had installed in his barn, translating the alien languages into English as representatives from dozens of species debated humanity's unprecedented display of voluntary coordination. The revelation that an entire planet could organize complex operations without central authority had sent shockwaves through galactic civilization. For millennia, the fundamental assumption of interstellar governance had been that advanced coordination required hierarchical command structures. The human demonstration challenged this core belief and threatened to destabilize political systems across hundreds of worlds. Chancellor Vexthari of the Crystalline Hegemony spoke first, her words reverberating through the council chamber like breaking glass. The Earth demonstration represents a dangerous deviation from established civilization protocols. If subordinate populations believe they can self-organize without proper authority structures, the stability of our alliance systems could collapse. Jake frowned as he listened to the translation. It bothered him that these alien leaders seemed more concerned about maintaining their political control than learning about potentially better ways to organize society. But Zarathul explained that this reaction was entirely predictable. Most galactic civilizations achieved interstellar status through conquest and centralized control, she said quietly. The idea that advanced coordination might emerge naturally from voluntary relationships threatens everything they believe about power and governance. If humans can accomplish complex tasks without coercion, what does that say about the necessity of their authority? The debate continued for hours as representatives from various species analyzed the implications of human agricultural cooperation. The mechanical collective argued that organic cooperation was inherently unstable compared to algorithmic coordination. The psionic communion claimed that human cooperation only worked because of primitive emotional bonds that were inferior to telepathic unity. But other voices began to emerge, species that had been quietly skeptical about the effectiveness of imperial governance models. The nomadic traders, who had spent centuries facilitating commerce between distant worlds, spoke about the efficiency they had observed in human coordination networks. The Earth demonstration achieves resource allocation efficiency ratings that exceed our own commercial optimization algorithms, declared Trade Master Kilthenner through a series of musical tones. Their voluntary coordination eliminates transaction costs that plague our centrally managed distribution systems. This suggests potential improvements to galactic commerce networks. The real surprise came when Ambassador Kyrith of the Verdant Collective requested permission to address the Council. The Verdant were a plant-based species that had always been considered primitive by the major galactic powers because they lacked centralized government structures. Their worlds were organized through what other species dismissed as chaotic biological networks. The human demonstration mirrors coordination patterns that have sustained our civilization for millennia. Kyrith transmitted through chemical signals that the Council's translation systems converted to audible speech. We have observed that voluntary cooperation can achieve stability and efficiency that rival or exceed centralized systems, particularly when dealing with environmental uncertainty and resource variability. This unexpected support from the Verdant shifted the tone of the debate. Suddenly, human agricultural cooperation was not just an isolated anomaly, but part of a broader pattern that other successful civilizations had discovered independently. The implications were staggering for species whose entire political systems were built on assumptions about the necessity of hierarchical authority. Jake watched Ambassador Kethrak's expression as the draconian hardliner realized that the human demonstration had become a catalyst for questioning fundamental assumptions about galactic governance. Other species were beginning to examine their own coordination systems and wonder whether alternative approaches might be more effective. The humans have demonstrated impressive tactical coordination, Kethrak admitted grudgingly during his turn to address the Council. But their system lacks the strategic depth necessary for interstellar operations. Voluntary cooperation may suffice for primitive agricultural activities, but advanced civilizations require authority structures capable of making difficult decisions and enforcing necessary sacrifices. Jake stood up from his chair, surprising everyone, including himself. May I respond to that? The barn fell silent except for the humming of alien communication equipment. Zarathul looked at him with concern. Jake, you are not officially recognized as a representative of your species. The Council protocols do not provide for. I'm not trying to represent humanity, Jake interrupted. I just want to answer a direct criticism of something I helped create. After rapid consultation with Earth's official diplomatic team, permission was granted for Jake to address the Galactic Council. The stakes could not have been higher. His words would be heard by billions of beings across the galaxy and could influence humanity's future among the stars. Ambassador Kethrak says that voluntary cooperation can't handle strategic decisions or enforce necessary sacrifices. Jake began, his voice carrying across interstellar communication networks to alien worlds he could barely imagine. But I think he's misunderstanding what human cooperation actually looks like. He gestured toward the data displays showing real-time agricultural operations across Earth. What you've been watching isn't just farmers sharing resources. It's millions of people making strategic decisions every day about long-term food security for our entire planet. Every farmer who plants crops is making a strategic decision about what humanity will need months in the future. Every investment in soil conservation is a sacrifice for future generations. Jake warmed to his subject, drawing on decades of experience managing the long-term challenges of agricultural sustainability. Ambassador Kethrak talks about enforcing necessary sacrifices, but humans make those sacrifices voluntarily when we understand the consequences of not making them. We don't need someone to force us to conserve soil or manage water resources. We do it because we understand that our children's future depends on those decisions. He pointed to specific examples from the ongoing demonstration. Look at the farmers who are sharing expensive equipment even though it means they earn less profit this season. Look at the transportation companies that are optimizing routes for system efficiency rather than individual company benefit. Look at the processing facilities that are coordinating schedules even though it reduces their flexibility. The council chamber was silent as Jake continued. These aren't tactical decisions made by individuals thinking only about immediate benefits. These are strategic decisions made by people who understand that their long-term success depends on the health of the entire system they participate in. Ambassador Visendra of the Draconian Technical Faction spoke next. But how do you ensure that individuals will continue making such sacrifices when immediate self-interest conflicts with long-term collective benefit? Without enforcement mechanisms, rational actors should defect from cooperation when it serves their individual advantage. Jake smiled, recognizing the classic game theory problem that economists had been debating for generations. You're assuming that humans are purely selfish, rational actors who only care about immediate individual benefit. But that's not how we actually work. We're social beings who care about our reputation, our relationships, and our community's future. He explained the concept that rural communities understood intuitively. Social capital and long-term reciprocity created incentive structures that aligned individual and collective interests without requiring external enforcement. When a farmer helps his neighbors during an emergency, he's not just being altruistic. He's investing in a network of mutual support that'll depend on when he faces his own emergencies. When a community maintains infrastructure that everyone uses, each person benefits even though they could theoretically free ride on others' contributions. Jake paused, looking directly at the holographic display where alien faces watched him with expressions he was learning to read. The key insight is that humans are good at taking long-term perspectives and understanding complex interdependencies. We don't need external authority to make us cooperate when we can see that cooperation serves our actual interests. The debate that followed his address continued for another 6 hours, with species representatives analyzing the implications of human cooperation for their own civilizations. Jake was amazed to learn that many galactic species had been struggling with problems that human cooperation might help solve. The Hive Mind Collective, despite their name, actually struggled with coordination because their telepathic unity was perfect but inflexible. They could not adapt quickly to changing conditions because consensus required total agreement. The human model of partial coordination with local autonomy offered potential solutions to their adaptation challenges. The warrior clans had achieved impressive military coordination, but struggled with economic development because their hierarchical culture discouraged the innovation and entrepreneurship that thrived under voluntary systems. Human cooperation demonstrated how to maintain social cohesion while encouraging individual initiative. Even the Advanced AI Confederacy was interested in human cooperation models. Their algorithmic coordination was extremely efficient for routine operations, but struggled with novel situations that required creative problem-solving. The human ability to coordinate through informal communication and shared understanding offered insights for improving AI social protocols. But the most significant development came when Chancellor Mordak of the Draconian Empire joined the debate. This was the supreme authority figure in one of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations, and his words carried enormous weight throughout known space. The human demonstration has forced us to confront uncomfortable questions about the efficiency and sustainability of our own governance systems, Mordak declared, his deep voice carrying the authority of millennia of imperial tradition. While I do not question the strength and stability that hierarchical authority provides, I cannot ignore evidence that alternative coordination methods might achieve superior results under certain conditions. Jake held his breath as the Chancellor continued. This was the moment that would determine whether the harvest demonstration would be dismissed as an interesting curiosity or recognized as a significant contribution to galactic civilization. Therefore, I propose that the Empire initiate comprehensive studies of human coordination methods, with the goal of determining whether hybrid governance systems might combine the best aspects of hierarchical authority and voluntary cooperation. Ambassador Zarathul will lead this investigation, working directly with human partners to develop practical applications. The announcement sent shock waves through the Galactic Council. If the Draconian Empire was willing to seriously study human cooperation methods, other civilizations would be forced to do the same or risk falling behind in governance innovation. But Jake realized that Chancellor Mordak's announcement also contained a subtle political message. By putting Zarathul in charge of studying human cooperation, He was essentially endorsing her choice of a human mate and legitimizing the cultural exchange that had started this entire chain of events. The council session ended with the establishment of the Interspecies Cooperation Research Initiative, a joint project involving dozens of galactic civilizations studying alternative coordination methods. Earth would serve as the primary research location, with human communities working alongside alien researchers to develop practical applications of voluntary cooperation principles. As the holographic display shut down, Jake found himself sitting in his barn surrounded by alien communication equipment, trying to process what had just happened. A few days ago, he had been a simple farmer worried about his crop yields. Now he was apparently a key figure in a galactic research initiative that might reshape civilization across hundreds of worlds. Zarathol joined him in the gathering darkness, her scales reflecting the last rays of sunlight streaming through the barn windows. "You realize what you have accomplished?" she asked softly. "You have not merely demonstrated human agricultural cooperation. You have challenged the fundamental assumptions that govern galactic civilization." Jake nodded slowly. "I'm starting to understand that, but I'm also starting to understand the dangers. There are a lot of powerful beings out there who won't want their authority systems questioned, no matter how efficient the alternatives might be." His concerns proved to be well-founded. Even as the official Galactic Council endorsed the research initiative, intelligence reports began flowing in about hardliner factions across multiple species that viewed the human demonstration as a threat to be eliminated rather than an innovation to be studied. The Hegemony Enforcement Corps had begun mobilizing stabilization forces to deal with what they called coordination contamination spreading to their subordinate worlds. The Imperial Guard's Special Operations Division was reportedly developing contingency plans for removing disruptive influences from Earth before they could spread further. Most ominously, the Shadow Syndicate, a secretive organization that operated across multiple species and civilizations, had apparently placed what their intelligence networks called termination bounties on key figures in the human cooperation movement, including Jake himself. "The success of your demonstration has made you valuable, but also dangerous," Zarathol warned as they reviewed the intelligence reports. "There are factions that would rather destroy Earth than allow human cooperation methods to spread to other worlds. They see voluntary coordination as a threat to everything they have built their power on." Jake looked out at his wheat fields, where the golden grain was nearly ready for harvest. A few weeks ago, those fields had represented his entire world. Now they had become the center of a conflict that could determine the future of galactic civilization. "So what do we do?" he asked. Zarathol's scales shifted to a determined metallic blue. "We plant more seeds," she said. "We expand the cooperation network beyond Earth, and we make it too large and too valuable for anyone to destroy. If we can demonstrate that voluntary cooperation makes entire civilizations more prosperous and stable, the political pressure will shift in favor of adoption rather than elimination." Jake realized that she was proposing something far more ambitious than agricultural demonstration. She was talking about fundamentally reshaping galactic civilization through the patient cultivation of voluntary cooperation networks that would eventually span multiple worlds and species. It was an audacious plan that would require everything he had learned about farming: patience, persistence, careful preparation of growing conditions, and faith that seeds planted today would eventually bear fruit. The only difference was that this time, he would be planting the seeds of interstellar civilization rather than corn and wheat. The galaxy had been stunned by dragon wives and Earthling farmers working together to demonstrate the power of voluntary cooperation. Now they had to prove that cooperation could grow beyond demonstration into something that would benefit every species among the stars. As Jake prepared for the challenges ahead, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that morning when he first saw alien ships descending through Earth's atmosphere. He was no longer just a farmer from Nebraska. He had become a seed planter for the future of galactic civilization itself. 6 months after the harvest demonstration, Jake Morrison found himself standing on the observation deck of the Draconian research vessel Harmony's Edge *, watching 3 moons rise over the agricultural world of Kepler 442b. The planet below hosted the first interstellar test of human cooperation principles. where colonists from 5 different species were attempting to establish sustainable communities using voluntary coordination methods. The journey from his Nebraska farm to this distant world had been surreal. The Interspecies Cooperation Research Initiative had moved with unprecedented speed, driven by early results that exceeded everyone's expectations. Initial pilot programs on draconian worlds had demonstrated efficiency improvements of 40% over traditional imperial coordination methods, leading to rapid expansion of the research project. But the real breakthrough had come when the nomadic traders requested permission to implement human cooperation protocols in their commercial networks. Within 3 months, transaction costs had dropped by 60%, while customer satisfaction ratings reached all-time highs. The economic benefits were so dramatic that even the most conservative civilizations began demanding access to cooperation training programs. The agricultural settlements are exceeding productivity projections by 37%, reported Dr. Sarah Chen, the former State Department agent who had become Earth's lead coordinator for the research initiative. She had adapted remarkably well to working with alien scientists, developing communication protocols that enabled effective collaboration across species with radically different cognitive patterns. Jake nodded as he studied the agricultural data streaming from the planet below. Draconian strength and engineering expertise combined with human coordination methods were proving to be a powerful combination. But perhaps more importantly, the mixed species communities were developing new social structures that neither species could have achieved alone. Zarathol joined them on the observation deck, her scales now displaying complex patterns that Jake had learned to read as contentment mixed with anticipation. Their relationship had evolved far beyond the political alliance that had brought them together. They had become genuine partners in every sense, combining their different strengths to tackle challenges that neither could handle independently. The Council of Worlds has formally requested expansion of cooperation training to 12 additional species, she announced. The demand is overwhelming our current capacity to provide instruction and oversight. We need to develop scalable methods for transferring cooperation knowledge across galactic distances. Jake smiled at the irony. The same voluntary coordination principles that had initially been dismissed as primitive chaos were now in such high demand that they faced classic scaling challenges. But he had learned to think beyond his original agricultural focus, applying the same basic principles to problems of interstellar education and knowledge transfer. We need to create cooperation networks among the trainers themselves, he suggested. Instead of trying to centrally manage all training programs, we establish regional centers that share resources and coordinate their activities voluntarily. Each center adapts the basic principles to local conditions while maintaining communication with other centers. Dr. Chen was already taking notes on her tablet. We could use the same peer-to-peer learning methods that worked so well in agricultural communities. Experienced practitioners teaching newcomers while continuing to learn from each other. No central curriculum, but shared principles and collaborative problem-solving. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication from the planet below. Settlement Alpha 7, one of the most successful mixed-species communities, was reporting unusual activity in the outer system. Long-range sensors had detected a fleet of unidentified vessels approaching from the direction of hegemony space. Zarathol's scales immediately shifted to the dark metallic pattern that Jake recognized as combat readiness. The Hegemony Enforcement Corps, she said grimly. They have finally decided to take direct action against the cooperation experiments. The crystalline hegemony had been one of the most vocal opponents of the cooperation research, claiming that voluntary coordination undermined necessary authority structures and threatened galactic stability. Their worlds were organized around rigid hierarchies maintained through sophisticated surveillance and control systems that monitored every citizen's activities and thoughts. The success of voluntary cooperation threatened the fundamental justification for the hegemony's oppressive systems. If other civilizations could achieve superior results through freedom and voluntary association, populations under hegemony control might begin demanding similar freedoms for themselves. How many ships? Jake asked, though he realized the question revealed his own limitations. He was still learning to think in terms of interstellar conflict and the vast scales of space warfare. 47 vessels, including 3 Dreadnought-class command ships, Zarathol replied after consulting her tactical displays. Sufficient firepower to destroy everything in this system, including the research stations and agricultural settlements. They are not here to negotiate. Jake felt a chill of fear, not just for himself, but for the thousands of beings on the planet below who were peacefully building new kinds of communities. The agricultural settlements included families with children, researchers pursuing scientific advancement, and volunteers from dozens of species who had come to learn about cooperation methods. "Can we evacuate everyone in time?" he asked. Dr. Chen was already coordinating with the settlement administrators. "Negative. The civilian transports can't possibly evacuate 40,000 colonists before the hegemony fleet arrives. We need another solution." Jake found himself thinking like a farmer facing an incoming storm that threatened to destroy his crops. Sometimes you couldn't prevent the damage, but you could minimize it through preparation and creative problem-solving. Sometimes you could even turn a threat into an opportunity. "What if we don't try to hide from them?" he suggested. "What if we show them exactly what they're trying to destroy?" Zarathol turned to look at him with the expression he had learned meant she was considering a radical possibility. "Explain your reasoning." Jake pointed toward the planet, where lights were beginning to flicker on across the agricultural settlements as the colonists began their daily work routines. "The hegemony commanders are here to destroy something they think threatens their authority, but they probably don't really understand what voluntary cooperation looks like in practice. They're operating from theoretical fears rather than direct experience." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "What if we invite them to observe the settlements before they attack? Let them see for themselves what we've actually built here. Maybe some of them will realize that cooperation doesn't threaten legitimate authority. It only threatens illegitimate oppression." Dr. Chen looked skeptical. "You want to invite an invasion fleet to tour our settlements? That seems incredibly naive, Jake. These are military commanders who have been ordered to eliminate a threat. They're not tourists looking for educational experiences." But Zarathol was nodding slowly. "There is precedent in draconian military history. The honor protocols require commanders to understand their targets before engaging in destructive actions. If we formally invoke those protocols, they would be obligated to investigate before attacking." Jake didn't fully understand the complexities of interstellar military law, but he could see that Zarathol was identifying a possible diplomatic solution. Would the hegemony forces recognize draconian honor protocols? "They would have to," she replied. "The protocols are recognized by all signatories to the Galactic Warfare Conventions. Violating them would be considered a war crime that could trigger intervention by the peacekeeping forces." The next few hours involved frantic diplomatic activity as Earth's representatives worked with draconian authorities to formally invoke the honor protocols. The legal framework was complex, requiring guarantees of safe passage for hegemony observers while establishing strict limitations on their activities within the system. But Jake realized that legal technicalities were only part of the solution. Even if they succeeded in getting hegemony commanders to visit the settlements, there was no guarantee that exposure to voluntary cooperation would change their minds about its dangers. They might simply gather intelligence that would make their eventual attack more effective. The key would be ensuring that the hegemony observers experienced voluntary cooperation directly rather than just observing it from a distance. They needed to participate in community activities that would demonstrate the benefits of cooperative relationships through personal experience. "We need to give them problems to solve," Jake explained to the settlement coordinators during an emergency planning session. "Not artificial demonstrations, but real challenges that require cooperation to address effectively. Let them discover for themselves how voluntary coordination works when they're actually participating in it." Dr. Chen understood immediately. Create situations where they have to rely on cooperative relationships to achieve their own objectives. Make cooperation the most effective path to their goals rather than trying to convince them through argument or propaganda. The settlement communities embraced this approach with enthusiasm that surprised Jake. Instead of hiding from the approaching threat, they began preparing to welcome hegemony observers as temporary community members who would contribute to ongoing projects while learning about cooperation methods through direct experience. When the hegemony fleet finally arrived in system, They found not a population cowering in fear, but agricultural communities that formally invited their representatives to participate in harvest activities, construction projects, and resource distribution programs. The invitation was delivered through official diplomatic channels with full legal protection under the honor protocols. Commander Vexthanes of the Hegemony Enforcement Corps was clearly uncomfortable with the situation. His mission orders called for the elimination of cooperation experiments that threatened galactic stability, but the legal invocation of honor protocols required him to conduct thorough investigation before taking destructive action. "This appears to be a delaying tactic," he transmitted to the research vessel. "My investigation will be comprehensive but brief. Do not mistake legal compliance for sympathy toward your dangerous experiments." Jake watched the first Hegemony shuttles descend toward the agricultural settlements, carrying armed observers who expected to find evidence of chaos and inefficiency that would justify their mission to eliminate voluntary cooperation. Instead, they were about to experience something that might change their fundamental understanding of how civilizations could organize themselves. The initial reports from Hegemony observers were predictably negative. They criticized the lack of visible authority structures, the apparent confusion of overlapping responsibilities, and the inefficiency of consensus-building processes. But Jake noticed that their criticisms began to change as they spent more time actually participating in community activities. Commander Vexthanes himself was assigned to work with the Agricultural Coordination Center, where he expected to find chaos and poor planning. Instead, he found a sophisticated information network that enabled rapid response to changing conditions and efficient allocation of resources across multiple settlements. "How do you maintain quality control without hierarchical supervision?" he asked during his second day of observation. Settlement coordinator Maria Santos explained the peer review systems that had evolved naturally among the colonists. "When everyone's success depends on everyone else's performance, people become very good at helping each other maintain high standards. It's not punishment-based like traditional supervision. It's support-based." Jake watched through remote monitors as Commander Vexthanes gradually began to understand how voluntary cooperation created its own accountability mechanisms. When problems arose, they were solved through collaborative effort rather than authoritative decree. When conflicts emerged, they were resolved through negotiation and compromise rather than power struggles. More importantly, the Hegemony commander began to experience the personal satisfaction that came from contributing to collective achievements. He was assigned to help coordinate water distribution systems, and he found himself taking pride in optimizing flow patterns that served the entire community rather than advancing his own individual status. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. After 5 days of direct participation in settlement activities, Commander Vexthanes requested a private meeting with Jake and Zarathol. "I am beginning to understand why the Hegemony leadership considers voluntary cooperation to be dangerous," he said, his crystalline features reflecting complex emotions that Jake couldn't interpret. "Not because it creates chaos or inefficiency, but because it makes hierarchical control seem unnecessary and oppressive by comparison." Jake nodded carefully. "That wasn't our intention. We're not trying to overthrow anyone's government. We're just trying to show that there are different ways to organize society that might work better under certain circumstances." The Hegemony commander was quiet for a long moment. "My people have maintained order and prosperity for millennia through careful control and structured authority. But I have observed productivity and satisfaction levels in these settlements that exceed anything I have experienced in Hegemony territories." He paused, clearly struggling with concepts that challenged everything he had been taught about civilization and governance. The question is whether such cooperation could be sustained on the scale of interstellar civilization, or whether it only works in small communities where individuals can maintain personal relationships with everyone they interact with. Zarathol leaned forward. "That is exactly what we are trying to discover through this research. We do not claim that voluntary cooperation can replace all forms of authority in all circumstances. We are exploring how cooperative methods might complement traditional governance to create more effective hybrid systems." Commander Vexthanes considered this possibility. If voluntary cooperation could improve hegemony efficiency without undermining necessary control structures, the leadership might be interested in limited experimentation. But any such programs would need to demonstrate clear benefits while maintaining system stability. Jake realized that they had reached a crucial turning point. The hegemony commander was not going to order the destruction of the agricultural settlements. Instead, he was beginning to consider how cooperation methods might actually strengthen rather than threaten his civilization. Over the following weeks, similar conversations took place between hegemony observers and settlement coordinators throughout the system. The military personnel who had arrived expecting to eliminate a threat were instead discovering potential solutions to problems their own civilization had been struggling with for generations. The hegemony's rigid hierarchical structures had created impressive order and control, but they had also generated economic inefficiencies, social tensions, and innovation bottlenecks that voluntary cooperation methods might help address. Instead of viewing cooperation as a threat to be eliminated, the observers began to see it as a tool that could enhance their civilization's capabilities. The final breakthrough came when Commander Vexthanes requested permission to establish a joint research program between the hegemony and the Cooperation Initiative. Rather than destroying the agricultural settlements, his forces would help expand them while studying how voluntary coordination might be adapted to hegemony social structures. Jake stood on the observation deck of Harmony's Edge Asterisk watching hegemony and draconian ships working together to deliver supplies to the expanding settlements. A few months ago, those same ships had been preparing for battle. Now they were collaborating on the largest interspecies cooperation experiment in galactic history. The seeds are taking root, Zarathul observed, joining him at the viewport. Not just in soil, but in minds and hearts across multiple civilizations. Voluntary cooperation is beginning to transform how species think about their relationships with each other. Jake nodded, though he also felt the weight of responsibility for what they had started. The success of cooperation experiments was creating demand that might exceed their ability to provide guidance and support. They were approaching the point where voluntary cooperation would need to become self-sustaining across galactic distances. But that was a challenge for tomorrow. Today, he was content to watch the lights of peaceful settlements twinkling on the planet below, knowing that thousands of beings from different worlds were learning to work together not because they were forced to, but because they had discovered that cooperation made all their lives better. The galaxy was no longer just stunned by dragon wives and earthling farmers. It was beginning to embrace the revolutionary idea that civilizations built on voluntary cooperation might be stronger and more prosperous than those built on conquest and control. 2 years after the first harvest demonstration, Jake Morrison stood before the Grand Assembly of the Galactic Confederation, addressing representatives from over 300 species about the transformation that voluntary cooperation had brought to interstellar civilization. The massive chamber buzzed with translation, devices converting his words into thousands of different languages and communication methods. The changes had been remarkable and far-reaching. Voluntary cooperation networks now spanned 47 star systems, connecting agricultural worlds, research stations, trading posts, and industrial centers in a web of mutual benefit that had revolutionized galactic economics and politics. Trade efficiency had improved by an average of 70%. Conflict resolution times had decreased dramatically, and citizen satisfaction ratings had reached unprecedented levels across participating worlds. But perhaps most significantly, the cooperation networks had prevented 3 separate interstellar wars through patient mediation and creative problem-solving that addressed the underlying causes of conflict rather than just treating symptoms. The galaxy was becoming not just more prosperous, but more peaceful. When Ambassador Zarathul first arrived on Earth, Jake began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems, she told me that marriage represented the ultimate merger of souls, minds, and purposes. I thought she was talking about our personal relationship. I didn't understand that she was really describing what could happen between entire civilizations. He gestured toward the viewing screens that showed real-time data from cooperation networks across the galaxy. Agricultural worlds sharing growing techniques that had increased food production by 40%. Research stations collaborating on scientific projects that were advancing knowledge faster than ever before. Industrial centers coordinating production to eliminate waste and optimize resource utilization. What we've discovered over the past 2 years is that voluntary cooperation isn't just a nice ideal. It's a practical tool for solving problems that seemed impossible under traditional governance systems. When beings work together because they want to rather than because they're forced to, they accomplish things that surprise everyone, including themselves. The response from the assembled representatives was mixed, but increasingly positive. Species that had initially been skeptical about cooperation methods were now requesting training programs and technical assistance. Even some of the most hierarchical civilizations had begun implementing hybrid systems that combined traditional authority structures with voluntary coordination networks. The crystalline hegemony had become one of the most enthusiastic adopters, despite their initial opposition. Commander Vexthanes had returned to his home worlds with detailed reports about cooperation effectiveness, leading to pilot programs that had improved hegemony productivity while actually strengthening rather than undermining their authority structures. We discovered that voluntary cooperation doesn't replace legitimate authority, explained Chancellor Crixthal of the Hegemony Central Council during his address to the Assembly. Instead, it makes authority more effective by ensuring that citizens participate willingly in collective goals rather than merely complying with orders. The hegemony's success had encouraged other species to experiment with cooperation methods adapted to their specific cultural and biological characteristics. The hive mind collective had developed partial coordination protocols that maintained their unity while allowing local adaptation. The warrior clans had created honor-based cooperation systems that channeled their competitive instincts toward collective achievement. Even the artificial intelligences of the AI Confederacy had modified their programming to incorporate cooperation algorithms that improved their ability to work with organic species. The AIs had discovered that voluntary cooperation provided a framework for navigating the complex social relationships that had previously frustrated their logical decision-making processes. But the most dramatic transformation had occurred within the Draconian Empire itself. Zarathal's success as Jake's partner had inspired other Draconian diplomats to seek cross-species alliances based on cooperation rather than conquest. The Empire was evolving from a military hierarchy into a voluntary confederation of allied worlds united by mutual benefit rather than force. The Empire has become stronger, not weaker, through voluntary cooperation, declared Emperor Sharthek during his unprecedented address to the Galactic Assembly. Our allies are more loyal because they choose to be with us rather than being compelled to submit to us. Our territories are more prosperous because local populations participate enthusiastically in imperial projects rather than merely tolerating occupation. Jake watched from the speaker's podium as species representatives, who had been enemies for millennia, began discussing joint cooperation projects. The Mechanical Collective and the Organic Alliance were planning agricultural automation systems that would benefit both civilizations. The Psionic Communion and the Technological Federation were developing communication protocols that bridged the gap between mental and electronic networks. The cooperation revolution had created opportunities for collaboration that transcended the ancient rivalries and territorial disputes that had shaped galactic politics for millennia. Species were beginning to see each other as potential partners rather than inevitable competitors. But Jake also recognized that the transformation was far from complete. There were still civilizations that viewed cooperation networks as threats to their power and security. The Shadow Syndicate continued to operate in the background, attempting to destabilize cooperation experiments through sabotage and assassination attempts. Several military factions within various empires were plotting to restore traditional conquest-based expansion policies. The real test would come when cooperation networks faced their first major crisis. Jake had learned enough about galactic history to know that periods of prosperity and cooperation were often followed by conflicts that tested the strength of voluntary alliances. The cooperation systems would need to prove their resilience under pressure before they could be considered truly stable. That test came sooner than anyone expected. During Jake's address to the Assembly, emergency alerts began flashing on communication panels throughout the chamber. Long-range sensors had detected a massive fleet approaching from beyond the galactic rim, ships using technology that no known civilization possessed. The extragalactic contact protocol was activated for the first time in recorded history. An unknown civilization with potentially hostile intentions was approaching inhabited systems, and every species in the galaxy suddenly faced an external threat that dwarfed their internal conflicts. Traditional military thinking would have called for immediate mobilization of all available forces under centralized command to meet the approaching threat. But Jake realized that this crisis offered an unprecedented opportunity to test whether voluntary cooperation could work under the most challenging circumstances possible. This is exactly what cooperation networks were designed for, he told the emergency session of the Assembly leadership. Unknown challenges that require creative solutions combining the strengths of multiple species. No single civilization has enough knowledge or resources to handle first contact with an extragalactic species, but together, we might be able to succeed where individual empires would fail. The proposal to coordinate the galactic response through voluntary cooperation rather than traditional military command structures was controversial and risky. Many species leaders argued that existential threats required clear chains of command and centralized decision-making. The margin for error was too small to experiment with untested coordination methods. But other representatives pointed out that traditional military responses had historically failed when dealing with truly unknown threats. The cooperation networks had developed expertise in adapting to unexpected challenges and finding creative solutions to complex problems. This flexibility might be more valuable than rigid military discipline when facing the unknown. The debate was resolved by Admiral Carthon of the Draconian Imperial Fleet, whose military reputation was unquestioned throughout the galaxy. "I have observed voluntary cooperation methods in operation for 2 years," he declared. "They consistently outperform traditional command structures when dealing with novel situations requiring rapid adaptation and creative problem-solving. If we are facing something truly unprecedented, cooperation networks offer our best hope for effective response." The decision to coordinate the galactic response through cooperation networks rather than military command structures was approved by a narrow margin. Jake found himself appointed as the primary human coordinator for what became known as the Extragalactic Contact Initiative, working alongside Zarathul and representatives from dozens of species to manage humanity's first encounter with beings from beyond their home galaxy. The approaching fleet consisted of 17 massive vessels, each larger than anything in the galactic database. Their technology appeared to be based on principles that local scientists couldn't identify, suggesting technological advancement far beyond current galactic capabilities. Traditional military analysis indicated that resistance would be futile if the newcomers proved hostile. But the cooperation networks approached the challenge differently. Instead of preparing for war, they focused on preparing for communication and potential partnership. If the extragalactic civilization was hostile, fighting was unlikely to succeed anyway. But if they were explorers or refugees, cooperation methods might turn a potential threat into an unprecedented opportunity. The breakthrough came when Dr. Sarah Chen's communication team successfully established basic contact with the approaching fleet. The newcomers identified themselves as the Andromedans, refugees from their home galaxy who had fled a cosmic catastrophe that was consuming entire star systems. They were seeking sanctuary and resources to rebuild their civilization. The Andromedans possessed technology that was indeed far advanced beyond galactic standards, but their society had been devastated by the disaster that had destroyed their home. They had vast knowledge and powerful capabilities, but they lacked the agricultural expertise, social coordination skills, and resource management techniques that would be necessary to rebuild their civilization in a new galaxy. "They need what we can offer," Jake realized during the first diplomatic meetings. "Not our military strength or our technology, but our cooperation methods and our understanding of how to build sustainable communities from scratch." The negotiation that followed was unlike anything in galactic history. Instead of discussing territorial concessions or tribute payments, the talks focused on how Andromedan refugees could be integrated into existing cooperation networks where they could contribute their advanced knowledge while learning local social and economic systems. The agricultural worlds offered to share growing techniques adapted to local conditions. The research stations proposed joint scientific projects that would benefit from Andromedan theoretical knowledge. The trading networks developed plans for integrating Andromedan capabilities into existing commercial systems. But perhaps most importantly, species throughout the galaxy volunteered to provide refuge and assistance to Andromedan civilians who had lost their homes and communities. The cooperation networks had created a culture of mutual aid that extended naturally to beings from beyond their own galaxy. The success of the Andromedan integration demonstrated that voluntary cooperation could work even under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. First contact with an extragalactic civilization had been transformed from a potential military crisis into an opportunity for mutual benefit and shared prosperity. 6 months later, Jake stood once again on the observation deck of Harmony's Edge Asterisk, but this time the ship was orbiting New Andromeda, the first joint galactic-extragalactic colony established through cooperation networks. Below, beings from dozens of species worked alongside Andromedan refugees to build communities that combined the best aspects of multiple civilizations. Zarathul joined him at the viewport, her scales now displaying the complex patterns that he had learned indicated deep contentment mixed with anticipation for future possibilities. Their partnership had evolved far beyond anything either of them could have imagined during those first awkward conversations on his Nebraska farm. "The seeds have grown beyond our wildest dreams," she observed, watching the lights of the growing colony spread across the planet's surface. "Voluntary cooperation has become the foundation for something unprecedented in cosmic history, a truly integrated civilization that spans galaxies and includes species we could never have imagined." Jake nodded, though he was already thinking about the challenges ahead. The success of cooperation networks had created new responsibilities and opportunities that would test their sustainability and adaptability. The Andromedans had brought knowledge of other galaxies and civilizations that would eventually require contact and potential cooperation. But more immediately, the cooperation networks were facing the classic challenge of success: rapid growth that threatened to overwhelm their capacity for maintaining quality and coherence. They needed to develop methods for scaling cooperation principles across cosmic distances while preserving the personal relationships and shared understanding that made voluntary coordination effective. "We need to create cooperation networks among the cooperation networks," Jake mused. "Meta-coordination systems that help local communities work together without losing their autonomy and flexibility." Zarathul smiled, the expression that had first made him realize she was not just an alien ambassador, but a person he could care about and work with as a true partner. Always the farmer, thinking about how to plant seeds that will grow into forests that plant their own seeds. Jake laughed, recognizing the truth in her observation. His approach to galactic civilization was still fundamentally agricultural, patient cultivation of conditions that would allow natural growth and adaptation, rather than forced development according to predetermined plans. As they watched the colony lights twinkle in the darkness below, Jake reflected on how far they had all come from that morning when alien ships first appeared over his wheat fields. He had expected first contact to change his life. He had never imagined that it would change the fundamental nature of civilization itself. The galaxy was no longer just stunned by dragon wives and earthling farmers. It had embraced a new way of organizing society that made every species stronger and more prosperous than they could have become alone. Voluntary cooperation had proven that the sum could indeed be greater than its parts, and that civilizations built on mutual benefit rather than conquest could achieve things that no empire based on force could accomplish. But perhaps most importantly, the cooperation revolution had demonstrated that ordinary people, farmers, traders, teachers, engineers, could change the course of cosmic history when they worked together toward common goals. The future of galactic civilization was being written not by emperors and generals, but by communities of beings who had learned to trust each other and build something better than anyone could create alone. Jake smiled as he watched a transport ship descend toward the colony, carrying more refugees and volunteers who would contribute their unique skills to the growing community. The harvest was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to show what could grow when the right seeds were planted in fertile ground and tended with care and patience. The galaxy had discovered that dragon wives and earthling farmers could indeed stun the cosmos, not through conquest or dominance, but through the revolutionary power of voluntary cooperation that made everyone stronger and more capable than they had ever imagined possible. and this was only the beginning of what they could accomplish together among the stars.